Hi, I'm Christopher Nichols. I'm a historian here at OSU. I'm the new director of our Center for the Humanities. Thanks. Come on down. The Center for the Humanities is for all of us, and it's a particularly important moment in U.S. and world history to think about the importance of the humanities. I also have the pleasure of leading our Citizenship and Crisis Initiative here at OSU. This talk is part of that series, co-sponsored by the OSU School of History and Religion. The series asks questions like, what is a citizen? How has citizenship changed over time? And in what ways have crises such as war or economic downturn impacted our understandings as well as practices of citizenship? And I would argue that there's no better moment to study this than during the World War I, 1914 to 1918 period, to understand some of the questions of citizenship cast in sharp relief given the exigencies of a global cataclysm and war. These and related questions then frame our multi-year interdisciplinary initiative program, which actually began in 2014 around questions of World War I. So we started with the centennial, and I'm really pleased to have our speaker here, Michael Kazin, to talk about this topic as well. Our main goal in the series is one of sort of engaged democracy. We're trying to use the best of history and the humanities to bring up issues that have great contemporary relevance, but to do so through the lens of analysis of fine-grained research and the ways that academic understanding can illuminate those sorts of questions. All right, now turning to this event, thanks are due to Natalia Bueno for her superb work in orchestrating getting our speakers here, arranging all sorts of other aspects of our programming, our great flyers. And thanks to Ryan Khalif, our lead intern on the program. Thanks also to the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, to directors Ben Muchler and Amy Kohlinger for their support, and CLA Dean Larry Rogers, who's been a great supporter of our programming in recent years. All right, moving on to our speaker. Michael Kazin is professor of history at Georgetown University. He is a historian I admire deeply, both for his political commitments and activism and for his intellect and studies of politics and social movements. As he puts it, he's studied politics and social movements mostly of the US, though in comparative frameworks as well. He's written on the order of 6 books, co-edited 3, regularly contributes to such newspapers and periodicals and websites as the New York Times, Washington Post, The Nation, American Prospect, Politico, New Republic, and of course he's also the editor of Dissent magazine, which is a leading magazine of the Democratic left, founded in 1954 by the august intellectual Irving Howe. He's received numerous awards and honors. I'll name a few. Now from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Guggenheim Foundation, Smithsonian, and the Woodrow Wilson Center. His most recent book, published in 2017, just in time for the centennial of the U.S. entry into World War I, is War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 and 1918, from Simon and Schuster. So get your copies. He's also published books, co-written a book with Maurice Isserman, America Divided, the Civil War of the 1960s, American Dreamers recently as well, How the Left Changed a Nation, published in 2011. It was the best book, named the best book by the New Republic, by Newsweek, Daily Beast, Progressive, a number of others. Also a fascinating study, one of my favorites of his works, A Godly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan, published in 2006 from Knopf. Really great work. But a personal favorite of mine that I've modeled some of my own work on is Populist Persuasion. His book, originally published by Cornell University Press in the 90s, it's really important in understanding the consequential movements of American populism and politics, tracing the emergence of the political campaigns of populism and rhetoric of populism from the 19th century all the way up to the present. And that seems particularly poignant in a moment like this in 2017. Finally, I'd like to just note personally that Michael Kazin is a generous scholar and intellectual. He took time to kindly mentor me at a couple panels when I was a graduate student, and even engaged critically with some of my work. The best sense of an intellectual trying to push you to your best kinds of arguments. And we pursued that in one roundtable that was on a book of mine, making some arguments about isolationism and internationalism in the American political tradition. It's very rare to find scholars who really believe in the intellectual community and network that makes us what we are. Sometimes we feel like we're in silos doing our work alone. It was when we're in conversation with others that I think we're at our best. And I think Michael Kazin's work really demonstrates how important that kind of set of connections is, from the scholarly to the political to the interventions to the community in which we operate. So with that, please help me in welcoming Michael Kazin.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for that lovely introduction. By the way, in the same spirit, you should read his great book, Peril and Promise, which is about American foreign policy and intellectual history of American foreign policy in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It's a book I leaned on in writing this book to a certain degree, and it's really one of the most important works written about which might call the intellectual history of American foreign policy in many, many years. In some ways, it's a worthy successor to the work by a guy named William Appleton Williams, who I'm sure you've heard of. He used to teach here. And in some ways, I think he's occupying Williams' chair, if you will. And thanks for coming on a beautiful day. I lived in Portland for 4 years in the early 1970s, and we didn't have too many beautiful days in the spring. So I know you probably don't either anymore, so I really appreciate you showing up. Hope it's worth it. And I'm curious to see what kind of questions you have about World War I and perhaps some of the contemporary relevance of some of the issues I'll be raising. I want to begin my talk by showing you photos of leaders of what was one of the largest anti-war coalitions, and I think one of the most sophisticated ones too, in American history. Nothing really to rival it until the Vietnam War, 50 years later. And this, as I said, was, I call it the war against war. This term comes actually from a famous essay the philosopher William James wrote, The Moral Equivalent of War, in which, I'm paraphrasing, he says the war against war is going to be no picnic, basically. Stopping wars is going to be very difficult, and as we know, it's been very difficult throughout history. But if you've never read that essay, you know it's one of the more serious grapplings with the questions of why people go to war, and how difficult it is to find alternatives to war. And that's one of the things people I wrote about were trying to do. Anyway, 4 leaders of this anti-war coalition, which I think I'll give you a very, very quick sketch of each of them, refer to them throughout the talk to a degree, shows you, I think, how ideologically and regionally and politically diverse this coalition was. One figure who most American historians, all American historians have heard of, was Senator Robert La Follette, progressive Republican from Wisconsin, a leader in the fight for labor rights in Congress, a leader, supporter of women's suffrage, one of the few white politicians at the time who was very much in favor of freedom and rights for African Americans. He was a leader of progressive Republicans in Congress, many of whom came from the Midwest. Then Crystal Eastman, who was a feminist, a suffragist, a socialist, though she didn't emphasize the socialist part of it. She was an organizational genius, too. She was the main figure behind, leadership behind two of the most important organizations of the Peace Coalition during World War I. The Women's Peace Party of New York, which was the largest detachment of the Women's Peace Party, which was a national organization led by Jane Addams, had 40,000 members at its height. And a group she was completely the head of, the American Union Against Militarism, which was founded in New York, and worked a lot with La Follette and others in Congress to try to stop preparedness, as it was called, that is, expansion of the size of the American military, and then morphed into a group called the National Civil Liberties Bureau, NCLB, during the war, once the U.S. declares war, supporting those who've been arrested for opposing the war. And later on, 1920, changed its name to a group you've all heard of, the American Civil Liberties Union. So Crystal Eastman was, in effect, a founder of the ACLU, among other things. Then Morris Hillquit, who was a leading socialist at the time when the Socialist Party of America was in its heyday, with 120,000 members, with over 1,000 elected officials of the Socialist Party at different local offices and 2 congressmen. And he was also the leading figure in the Socialist Party, writing the socialists' statements against the war. He had correspondence with socialists in Europe, where the socialist parties were much stronger, and whereas most of you know this, most of the socialist parties supported the countries going to war, which the Socialist Party in this country did not do. He was a Latvian immigrant, Jewish immigrant. He spoke 4 languages fluently, and so he was a key figure in the posture of the Socialist Party towards the war. And the Socialist Party also had very close relationships with many people in the trade union movement. Many unions at the time were led by socialists, especially those from unions which are full of Russian Jewish immigrants, German immigrants as well, who tended to be very much opposed to going to war. And finally, a figure who very few historians have heard of, though I'm sure Chris has, Claude Kitchen, a Democrat from North Carolina, a white supremacist, a militant foe of black rights, not surprisingly, being a white Southerner. In fact, he replaced the last black congressman from the South, who, in effect, was driven out of office by white mobs, some of which he was a member of. However, Kitchen was more complicated than just that. He was the House Majority Leader during the whole war, well, actually early 1915 up until 1919. Also head of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, which, as most of you know, is the committee which writes tax legislation. And he also was a leading figure in trying, in his own party, to stop the president of his own party, Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat after all, from supporting expansion of the military, and then he was one of the 50 congresspeople who opposed going to war. But he remained majority leader, even though he opposed one of the most momentous decisions the Congress had ever taken, a decision which was called for by the leader of his own party, Woodrow Wilson. So you can tell his colleagues thought a lot of him. And his anti-war position was not as unpopular, even when the U.S. went to war, as some conventional accounts have it being. So this gives you a sense of the breadth of this coalition. Inside Congress, outside Congress, socialists, radical feminists, white supremacists, progressive Republicans, and later on you'll show it included even Henry Ford, probably the most popular businessman in America, perhaps in the world at the time, the creator of the $5 day and, of course, of the Model T Ford. Let me clear up one common misconception, which I think Chris and I disagree with at the start. I don't think these people are isolationists. This term was applied retrospectively to them. The term itself didn't really become popular in American discourse till the 1920s and 1930s. You look at Google Ngram, Google Ngram, you can chart the popularity of different terms. Isolationist, completely flat until 1920, and all of a sudden, it zooms up. Because it was a retrospective critique of those who opposed the war. And then it gets applied to people like Charles Lindbergh and the America First campaign and other people who didn't want the U.S. to get into World War II. But except for Kitchen, I don't think any of these figures can really be called an isolationist. All of them, La Follette, Hillquit, Crystal Eastman, and most of the people they worked with, were very engaged in the world. They had good connections with people in Europe, progressives, suffragists, socialists. They all wanted a world order based on what you could call a socialized democracy. They all wanted peaceful, cooperative relationships between national states. In some ways, they wanted the same thing that Woodrow Wilson wanted, but they wanted to go even further and do away with all empires, not just the empires of those who got defeated in World War I, which, of course, Wilson supported. And also, they had a very formidable opposition. You recognize this man in the center, former President Theodore Roosevelt, still the most popular Republican in the country throughout the war. This was a meeting of a group called the National Security League, which, together with the Navy League, was a mass membership organization, mostly of pretty well-heeled Americans, so not all rich ones, who supported expanding the military to be the size of the militaries of the belligerent powers fighting the war in Europe. They wanted every American boy to have military training in schools. They wanted something like ROTC before it actually started in 1916 to be in high schools and even elementary schools. They believed that a citizenry that was trained to fight wars was a better citizenry. It can really make sure that the nation would be protected. And also they believed it would make better men. Of course, they weren't talking about women having military training at the time. And the National Security League and the Navy League and there's also an Army League had close connections to high circulation daily newspapers in the biggest cities outside the South. Nearly every major newspaper in America was in favor of preparedness, was in favor of by 1916 or 1917 going to war in Europe. Also, they had support from major industrial corporations that both for ideological and economic reasons favored building up U.S. forces, I think. I don't think the major reason why, by the way, the U.S. went to war, and there's still a lot of debate about this, and there was at the time, was because American industries wanted to make more money, or American bankers wanted to make sure their loans got paid back, loans they'd made to the British and the French. But they had connections, obviously, with the British and the French. American trade with the Allied powers was very important to getting the U.S. out of a recession in 1915 and 1916, and so it was not unimportant as a reason why they supported building up the military and then, for many of them, going to war. Now, at first, the Great War, as of course it was called and is still called in Europe, appalled Woodrow Wilson and appalled the great majority of his fellow Americans. On August 19th, 1914, the president made a short statement. This is part of it. Recognizing the people of the United States are drawn from many nations, and chiefly from the nations now at war, the president said he urged them to stay neutral in thought as well as deed. Otherwise, the one great nation still at peace, he said, would be unable to mediate the conflict when and if he chose to help do so. In New York City, there were hostile demonstrations, Germans and Irish Catholics demonstrating against British Americans and some Russian Americans on the streets of New York City. The mayor of New York at the time, a guy named John Mitchell, basically said to the police, try to stop all demonstrations because there's going to be bloodshed here if we keep them going. And that was one of the reasons, certainly not the only one by any means, why Wilson gave the speech to sort of tamp down this belligerent feeling. Because remember, a third of Americans at the time World War I began were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. 1/3, higher percentage than now, the highest percentage in American history. However, was Wilson truly neutral? I think not. He did nothing to compel American business to stay neutral, either in thought or in deed. In 1915, J.P. Morgan and Company had become the commission agent for the British. Every time the British bought something through J.P. Morgan and Company in the United States, whether more material or food, J.P. Morgan and Company got a tidy 1% commission on that, on that sale. Made millions and millions of dollars out of it. And Wilson also chose to threaten war, in the end went to war, over just one side's violation of neutral rights, that is Germany's U-boat warfare, and not the other side's, that is Britain's blockade of the North Sea, the only sea route to Germany. And this had a fateful consequence, as many of you know. Given how superior the British Navy was on the North Atlantic, submarine warfare was probably the only effective military response the Germans could have made to the blockade of their country, which was starving thousands of people, especially older people and young people by the time the war ended. So I think you could argue it was only a matter of time, given this situation, this unneutrality on Wilson's part, effective unneutrality, if you will, a matter of time before the U-boat attacks provoked the U.S. into declaring war. Of course, Wilson's choice was not an irrational one or an illegal one. The North Atlantic, unlike the North Sea, was a lifeline for U.S. commerce, had been since, well, obviously since before the United States was a nation. To destroy neutral ships, to kill neutral Americans who were on those ships, or who were on belligerent ships for that matter, was a violation of existing international law. The British blockade could be argued was and was not violating that law. So Wilson, his State Department counselors, legal counselors told him, was on firm ground in not trying to stop and declaring and threatening war over the British blockade of the North Sea, because it wasn't threatening American commerce. Also, the president was a lifelong Anglophile. His mother had been born in England. His greatest political heroes were Edmund Burke and William Gladstone. The Lake District was his favorite place on earth. Excuse me. Less than a month after Europeans went to war, Wilson told his closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, a German victory, quote, will change the course of our civilization and make the United States a militarist nation. In January 1917, just 10 days before the Germans resumed unrestricted U-boat warfare, which is the act which eventually brought the United States into the war, Wilson gave an amazing speech on the floor of Congress, both houses of Congress, where he called on both sides in the war to make a peace without victory. After millions of people had died, imagine the American president calling on these people to make a peace without victory. And he believed it. But much as he wished the United States could remain neutral, in the end, Wilson could not really choose not to care who won the war. In the end, of course, he made a decision, and the country, at least most of the country, went along with him, and most of Congress. In the end, the American decision to intervene played a critical role in who won the war. And what turned the tide against Germany was not the actual fighting that U.S. troops did, even though over 116,000 died altogether, about half of those in combat, half away from combat. But most of them died just in one battle, the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. This is wrong, by the way. It's 1918, sorry. If you're here for extra credit, don't write down 1917. Because you won't get a good grade. It was actually the bloodiest battle in American history, this battle. More Americans died in this one battle than any other battle in American history. But what made the difference was by the time this battle began, early fall of 1917, there were 2 million American troops, doughboys as they were called, in France, ready to fight, and another 2 million were being trained. If the war lasted until 1919, 4 million American troops would have been in Europe. The Germans would not have been able to withstand that. They knew that, which is one of the reasons why before a lot of American troops got there, in the spring of 1918, the Germans started a series of offensives which got them about 40 kilometers away from Paris. You could hear the big guns in Paris at the time. But that's all they had. That was their last blow. And then they started to retreat, and by November 11th, 1918, the war was over. General Erich Ludendorff, one of the two major commanders, together with Paul von Hindenburg of the German military, told his fellow commanders, "We must strike before America can throw her strong forces into the scale." They struck, it didn't work, and they lost the war, with the consequences we know about in the rest of the 20th century. And so the American troops made the difference, not in actual battle, but the prospect of all these fresh troops coming into the war forced, in a sense, compelled the Germans to throw all they had into these final offensives. Now, millions of Americans viewed with alarm both the idea of preparing to fight for war by building a huge military, and then the decision to go to war. And as I said, they organized the largest, most diverse, and most sophisticated anti-war coalition to that point in U.S. history. Little narrative about this coalition. First of all, it began with women. Those of you who've been following the news over the last few months, probably none of you have been, you know. There was this Women's March, January 21st, in Washington, D.C., opposing the new president's policies. But a lot of men went along, too. But the first march against World War I was only women. Men were not allowed to march. This took place late August 1914 on Fifth Avenue in New York City. About 2,000, mostly white, mostly Protestant, mostly feminist advocates for women's rights and international arbitration, marched down Fifth Avenue. They had 10 times that many people watching them from the pavement, from the sidewalks. And nearly every marcher, as you can see, was dressed in black to symbolize mourning. No national flags were allowed to be held. They invited women from the different belligerent countries, Belgium, Germany, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, to march with their national dress, but not with flags. No one could carry a flag. To show that women were beyond this, in effect. Women would or should be the peacemakers. The leader of the march was a woman named Fanny Garrison Villard, 69 years old. Her middle name, if you know anything about American history, ought to signify something. She was the daughter of William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, who was himself a pacifist until the Civil War. And Villard said at the end of the march, "I was more than surprised at the reverential attitude of the spectators. It was only a feeble effort, really, We have simply cast a pebble into the water. But I hope there will be more ever-widening circles that perhaps will make men realize what a crime it is to send thousands of husbands and fathers and sons to a useless slaughter. This symbolized a very deeply held belief among women activists at the time, reformers, progressives, as well as more radical socialists and anarchists like Emma Goldman, that men made war and women had to stop it. Women who brought up babies, women who took care of older people, were programmed, in a sense, hardwired biologically to make peace, whereas men, for all kinds of reasons, were perhaps hardwired to make war. And women had to take the lead in stopping them. That fall to European feminists from different belligerent nations, one named Rosika Schwimmer from Hungary, one named Emily Pethick Lawrence from Great Britain, came as sisters. They'd been met in suffrage meetings in Europe. They lectured in various American cities. They urged American feminists, some of whom had been on the march, some who had not, to form an organization, which in February 1914 they did, called the Women's Peace Party. 3,000 women were at the founding meeting. There were so many women who wanted to get into the Willard Hotel, which is this big hotel still right near the White House, that they had to have sort of overflow meetings outside the hotel. There's so many women who were delegates of different organizations, not just coming as individuals, who wanted to take part. The delegates included nearly every prominent female reformer in the country, from suffrage leaders like Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt to famous settlement house workers like Jane Addams, who was elected president of the Women's Peace Party. A couple months later, Jane Addams led a Women's Peace Party delegation. That's her up here. I should use my little pointer, shouldn't I? Is this the pointer? Yeah, there she is. To an international conference of women at The Hague, the capital of the neutral Netherlands, where she brought together German women and Belgian women, forced them to shake hands, which wasn't an easy thing to do, because the Belgian women, even though they were opposed to the war, they also didn't like the fact the Germans were, of course, occupying their country. And then after the conference was over, she and other American feminists went on a trip around various capitals in Europe, capitals of war, urging prime ministers and presidents and foreign secretaries to figure out a way to make peace. And the power of the feminist critique of war, of this war specifically, was so strong that it seeped into, well, you can see evidence from it in popular culture. I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier, the most popular song of 1915. How, before there were, Spotify or CDs or vinyl records, how did you know whether a song was popular or not? Anybody know? Any guesses?
Publication.
Right, sheet music, exactly. It's been estimated 800,000 copies of the sheet music were sold in 1915 alone, and some in 1916 as well. The song was written by a man, this guy, and usually sung by a man too, but clearly, you see from the lyrics, there was a very strong feminist content to the lyrics. Same time, a group of prominent progressives and radicals was meeting in New York and founded the American Union Against Militarism. It included household names at the time, but not household names, of course, today. Lillian Wald, who was, next to Jane Addams, the most important social worker and settlement house impresario, if you will, in America. Henry Street Settlement House in New York City, where my grandmother worked. They were friends. And Paul Kellogg, who was edited The Survey, which was a very popular magazine of American reform, housing reform, industrial reform, also was very in favor of women's suffrage and was in favor of peace as well. The AUAM, the American Union Against Militarism, included other figures like David Starr Jordan, former president of Stanford University, Oswald Villard, who was Fannie Villard's son, who was a publisher of the New York Post and The Nation magazine, and Stephen Wise, who was the most important leader of Reform Judaism in the country at the time. So it was hardly just sort of these, fringe radicals. And the anti-militarist coalition also included a large number of union members. At a time when, without going into detail about, I used to be a labor historian, so I love talking about the minutiae of labor history, but I won't bore you with that. The American Federation of Labor was, as most of you know, the leading labor federation in the country. There was a radical union federation called the Industrial Workers of the World that was completely against going to war. But the FFL was split. Its leader, Samuel Gompers, British immigrant, had been opposed to war. Once the war started, he was pro-British for his own reasons. He also thought that if the U.S. got into the war, labor ought to support it, or else it would be crushed by those who were supporting the war. So he, for practical reasons and I think ideological reasons, supported preparedness and then supported going to war. But a large number of delegates and leaders of major unions, the American Federation of Labor, opposed wars, as much as a third to half. Included leaders of such major unions as the United Mine Workers, the clothing workers, the textile workers, the butchers, many building trades, locals, and others. In 1916, in the summer, there were Preparedness Day parades supporting preparedness, supporting building up the military in many cities around the country. Hardly any labor unions marched in those parades. They're mostly pro-business marchers, and all the floats were pretty much sponsored by businesses or by the National Security League and pro-preparedness groups like that. And as the movement or coalition against the war, against going to war, blossomed and grew, it attracted powerful allies in Congress, like I mentioned, like La Follette and like Kitchen. And one of the leading figures in the Democratic Party, the president's own party, who Chris said, I told you I wrote a biography about, was a very strong figure supporting the peace coalition. And such a strong figure that he actually resigned as Secretary of State in 1915. He was Secretary of State for the first 2 years of Woodrow Wilson's administration, roughly. He resigned as Secretary of State because he thought in the spring of 1915 that the U.S. was about to get into war with Germany, and he opposed that. I can talk more about this in question period if you want. Basically what happened was Lusitania, the largest and fanciest ocean liner on the high seas, was torpedoed. A British ship was torpedoed by the Germans in May 1915. A couple thousand, 1,200 people died. About 120 of them were Americans. And it looked like the United States was going to get into the war at that point. There were angry notes that Wilson sent to the Germans. And even though, of course, Bryan didn't support the torpedoing of the ship and the killing of civilians, he believed that Americans should not have gone on a British ship in which there was munitions, over 4 million rounds of munitions in the hold, even though the British did not acknowledge that at the time. And so he resigned as Secretary of State on principle, which is very rare. He was the first Secretary of State to ever resign his office on principle. There's only been one other. Anybody know what the second one was? Not fair talking to the diplomatic historian here. Anybody else know? Cyrus Vance, who was Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State, who didn't like his tilt towards starting what he thought was a new Cold War in the late 1970s. Bryan was a leading figure among Democrats. Claude Kitchen, he were very close. And he helped to mobilize many of his fellow Democrats, especially from the South and the West, against preparedness and then against going to war. And not to be forgetting what an immigrant country this was at the time. This is a poster put out by one of the unions which opposed going to war. It was held at the Forward Building, which was the building which housed the leading Jewish socialist paper in the country at the time, the Jewish Daily Forward, which had a circulation of 250,000 every day in Yiddish. And you can see speeches were given in English, in Yiddish, in Russian, in Italian, and many more could be given too, in different languages. But the largest groups were going to clearly be Russian, Italian, Jewish, and of course English speakers. This shows you that Irish Americans didn't like the idea of going to war to support the British Empire until Tsar Nicholas fell from power in the February Revolution in 1917. Russian Jews abhorred the idea of going to war on the side of the Tsar, the world's leading anti-Semite. And also this was a very creative coalition. I haven't got time to go into all the things they did, but I just mentioned a couple of them. Of course, I detail much more in the book. They ran peace candidates for state and federal office, including Morris Hillquit, who ran for mayor of New York City in 1917 on an anti-war platform and got almost 25% of the vote in a four-man race. This was after the war had begun. They called for a national referendum to be held before Congress could vote on declaring war, something which got revived again in the 1930s when a Democratic congressman named Lewis Ludlow had a good chance of actually Congress passing that before Franklin Roosevelt sort of made sure that it never got to the floor of Congress. In New York City, the American Union Against Militarism put on a war against war exhibit, they called it, which this came later, this particular meeting. War against war exhibit included some wonderful, sort of depictions, dioramas, if you will, about war. It included Uncle Sam as a peace-minded man, looking friendly, holding children, and Uncle Sam armed to the teeth with guns sprouting from every pocket. The War Against War exhibit also had a papier-mâché life-size model of a stegosaurus. Why a stegosaurus? Well, the point was, it said, the caption under the stegosaurus said, this is the stegosaurus. It became obsolete. It had lots of armor plate and no brains. Which, of course, was what they thought about navies in the world and who ran them. And, as I mentioned before, this guy, Henry Ford, he said he was such a pacifist that in 1915 he said the word murderer should be embroidered in red on the uniform of every soldier. Henry Ford. And he had dinner with Jane Addams, and Jane Addams convinced him he'd got to do something about this, Henry. And Henry decided what he'd do is to make a big splash. He was good at making big splashes. He chartered a boat, a Norwegian boat, a ship filled with hundreds of pacifists and journalists, and went to Europe in December 1915, hoping to put together a conference of all the neutral nations to compel the belligerents to come to peace. It didn't happen, of course, and he was made fun of a lot. But some Americans said, well, at least he's trying something. Wilson's not doing anything. Well, I can talk more about this, but I'm talking too long as it is. Let me shift to talking about what motivated these people. I've described who they were and some of what they were doing. Clearly, they disagreed about a lot of domestic issues. Henry Ford didn't believe in a progressive income tax. The other ones did. Crystal Eastman and Morris Hillquit and Robert La Follette all believed in women's suffrage, all believed in ending Jim Crow laws, whereas Claude Kitchen supported them and opposed them, and he also was a prohibitionist, which they were not. But they all believed that the only way to avoid war was not to prepare for it. And they all were committed pacifists, as that term was defined at the time. Now we define the term pacifism to mean you don't want any conflict of any kind, right? You believe, we should try to get rid of the police if you could, get rid of all armies if you could. Only peaceful resolution of conflicts is a good idea, right? That's not what it meant at the time. What was to be called pacifist at the time meant you wanted some combination of arbitration, of mediation, of moral persuasion to avoid future wars. You didn't necessarily oppose the police cracking down on strikes, like Henry Ford was very much supportive of that, for example. It was about war. It was specifically about trying to find a way to avoid war. In fact, pacifists didn't oppose defensive wars. They only opposed offensive wars. Now, they used two different kinds of arguments. The first was the more radical one, as I mentioned before. They gestured towards a world of democratic nations which would never have either the cause or the will to take up arms ever again. Crystal Eastman put it this way in 1915. She said, "The national genius cannot be directed to war preparation and genuine peace at the same time. If we are to fill the public mind with the kind of enthusiasm which will be necessary to make a world union, we cannot at the same time rouse it with pictures of Germans bombarding New York and Japanese invading California." So they figured the only way to bring about a peaceful, harmonious, democratic world, a utopian vision to be sure, but one they devoutly believed in, was to make sure the U.S. was not ready to fight this huge war in Europe. The second argument was more defensive. They wanted to preserve the supposed virtues of the republic as it was against what they saw as the building of what we now call a national security state with a large permanent military establishment as part of it. The military-industrial complex, as Dwight Eisenhower famously put it right before he left office. And part of this was, to go back to populism, which is sort of evergreen topic, was critique that I mentioned before, which I don't completely agree with by any means, but was very widely held by those who opposed both preparedness and war. That is, war is only good for big business. War is only good for the rich. They make lots of money making all this stuff. It gets blown up, and you got to make more of it. And that gets blown up too. You make more of it. You know, it's great business. And here's Art Young, a radical cartoonist in The Masses, edited by Max Eastman, Crystal Eastman's brother. And there are a lot of cartoons of this kind. Down here is this wage slavery, of course, so showing his anti-capitalist, pro-labor sympathies. And in this sense, I think the anti-war movement was, even for the radicals who were part of it, like Hillquit and Eastman, a conservative cause. This was stated, I think, quite well by the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, William Stone, a rather conservative Democrat from Missouri, who was one of the 6 senators who actually voted against declaring war in early April 1917. As you see, he said, "I won't vote for this war because we go into it, we will never again have the same old republic." That is, they saw this as a watershed, as a crisis for American citizens and other Americans too, who aren't yet citizens. That if America went into the war, the very nature of the American state, the very nature of the citizens' relationship with the state would be changed forever. We can argue about whether that was true or not, but they believed that very devoutly. And that's why he voted against the war. And imagine the majority leader of the House of Representatives and the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, both Democrats, leading Democrats, voting to go to a war that the president of their own party, who's just been reelected a few months before, is calling for. You know, this probably wouldn't happen today. Who knows? Hope we don't have to find out. How are we doing on time here? All right. Well, of course, in the end, the peace movement lost. You probably knew that. I won't go into the details. I mentioned them a little bit before. And then once the U.S. does go to war, Wilson, with the aid of Congress and the courts, chose to prosecute the battle at home with a fervor neither his defenders nor his adversaries had really expected. The Espionage Act is passed in 1917, the Sedition Act, which was actually amendments to the Espionage Act in 1918. Together, they basically make opposing the war verbally or in print illegal. Now, of course, that didn't mean everybody who did that was prosecuted, but it meant you were in danger of being prosecuted. Even people who, when they were drunk, shouted out, "I hope the Kaiser wins," sometimes got prosecuted, and sometimes were put in jail for a few months, if not a year. So it was the most repressive period, I think, in American history, in terms of the government repressing free speech. And I think, again, this was not completely irrational, because sentiment against the war was so widespread. Opposition to the draft, actually, which we'll talk about in a second, was widespread enough so that Wilson and his cabinet members and the Justice Department really believed, I think, that if you just allow people to speak freely against the war, as they had before the U.S. declared war, this would cause a problem. Cause a problem for mobilizing enough U.S. troops to get to Europe. Cause a problem for the smooth running of the draft, which was a new idea in America. There had been no draft since the Civil War. So in that sense, it was terrible, but it was a terribleness, if you will, this repression, which had a certain rationale, which we have to, I think, respect. Randolph Bourne, famously liberal, progressive intellectual, writing during the war, said war is the health of the state, and I think it's hard to disagree with that. A little bit about the draft resistance at the time, which is actually not very well known, and not much researched either, because it's hard to research this. Conventional wisdom has it that American young men lined up dutifully, registered for the draft the first time on the same day in June 1917. And there was very little problem with it. Most people obeyed the law. They were gung-ho to go to the military, at least gung-ho enough so they weren't going to disobey the law. Not true. In fact, as many as 3 million eligible men never bothered to register at all for the draft. About 350,000 registrants either did not report to the camps as they were required to, or deserted from the training camps once they did report. Black Americans who suffered under Jim Crow laws were particularly loath to risk their lives in a war for democracy proclaimed by a president who promoted segregation. Many white small farmers and wage earners, especially in the South, Claude Kitchen country, bridled at taking part in what they condemned as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Unknown number of men fled across the border to Mexico, going the other way. There was no wall stopping them. Taken together, a higher percentage of American men chose to resist the conscription law during World War I than during the Vietnam conflict half a century later, even though that draft resistance is very well known. After the Allied victory, the U.S., of course, becomes the world's leading economy. But there was no peace without victory, as we know. Woodrow Wilson becomes the most famous, most beloved man in the world when he goes to Paris in 1919 because he was promising in the 14-point speech he gave while the war was still in progress in January 1918, and then after the war was over, he promised that the kind of peace he wanted, the kind of peace that actually the people in the anti-war movement wanted as well, would come to pass now the United States had won. But it wasn't to be. The other allies who had lost millions of men, in terms of the French, had lost, had much part of the northern part of their country destroyed by the trench warfare. We're not about to say, oh, okay, we'll let the Germans off. So the settlement, peace treaty settlement of Versailles did not last. Wilson did not get the Senate to approve the peace treaty either because he insisted on everything in the peace treaty as written being ratified by the Senate and included Article 10, which meant that the U.S. would have, at least in theory, had to go to conflicts around the world and help to resolve them with force of arms. And this would have threatened American sovereignty, as a lot of senators at the time saw it. Henry Cabot Lodge, who hated Wilson with a passion, was also Theodore Roosevelt's best friend, was by then chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. The Republicans took over the Senate in the 1918 election, and he was absolutely sure he wanted to defeat Wilson. Wilson did not give in to any kind of compromise, and the treaty failed in the Senate, and the U.S. did not join the League of Nations. And one could argue, and I argued this in this op-ed I had in the New York Times last week, and it's kind of factual and could easily be disagreed with, that the U.S. Decision to go into World War I and the victory of the Allies and the defeat of the Germans may well have made World War II much more likely because Adolf Hitler, as most of you know, he built his movement of former soldiers on the idea, the myth, the terrible myth that socialists and Jews had stabbed Germany in the back. And that Germany hadn't really lost the war, but it had just surrendered because it was betrayed at home. If the war ends up differently, that is, if the U.S. does not enter the war, it probably does end up differently, then who knows what would have happened. But hard to believe if Germany either wins the war or somehow there's a negotiated settlement that you have the rise of Adolf Hitler and his genocidal movement. So in the end, Wilson's unneutrality and the fact that it brought about a decisive Allied victory probably made a healing peace, a peace without victory, anything like a peace without victory, impossible. Well, finally, some comments on the memory of the war, and then I'll stop and take your questions, comments, and disagreements, perhaps. World War I is kind of a forgotten war, I think. I'm glad you're all here. You're interested in it. Some of you have to be here. I'm glad you came anyway. But it's not like World War II, the Civil War, Vietnam. We see this as moral conflicts, good ones, bad ones, whatever. But World War I is mysterious. I ask my students on November 11th, when I'm teaching class on November 11th, I say, so this is, we call this Veterans Day. Why November 11th? Why not some other day of the year? Sometimes they know if they've, they did real well in AP US history or European AP history, they know Otherwise, I don't know. You know, everyone knows December 7th, Pearl Harbor, right? And it's also interesting that Veterans Day used to be called Armistice Day, which of course conveyed the peace that took place. Whereas Veterans Day makes you think, of course, of the service of men who fought, which is somewhat different. Why is that, do you think? Well, first of all, I think it's because the U.S. did not spend a lot of time, fighting. American soldiers did not spend a lot of time actually fighting in the war. As I said, American soldiers engaged in serious fighting for about 6 months. 53,000 Americans lost their lives on the battlefield, more away from the battlefield, some from the terrible Spanish influenza, which especially hit young men, actually, who were packed close together, as people were on troop ships and in army camps. And then, of course, the Senate's refusal to ratify the peace treaty left the results of the war sort of seem ambiguous. Well, we won the war, but did we really win the war? And then, of course, then you had the rise of fascism and the Bolshevik Revolution, the consolidation of communism under Joe Stalin. It seemed like the last thing the war did was to make the world safe for democracy or to end all wars. So I think in the absence of a satisfying moral tale about the consequences of U.S. intervention, the lack of historical memory about World War I, at least in this country, is not too surprising. In Europe, it's a different matter, as some of you know. Every Armistice Day, if you're in Britain, they pass out poppies. And also when the war began, anniversary when the war began in August, they often do the same thing. So it's a huge thing in England, and of course in France and in Germany as well. But here it's not. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, and I'll finish here, is to try to get us to remember, because the United States has been at war through most of its history, if you include the wars against Native Americans, which I think you have to include, some of which took place in Oregon, of course. Even though the U.S. military was not that large, if you count state militias and the standing army, and of course Navy and Marines, the U.S. has been at war for the majority of the years of its history. But we know very little about those who opposed those wars, either as a whole or in part. And in part that's, I think, because anti-war movements are not like other movements. They're not continuous in the same way. Sure, there's little knots of pacifists in various groups. Fellowship of Reconciliation is a group I used to be a member of. The Friends Service Committee, groups like that. But in general, anti-war movements have to start again with every war. Not true for the black movement, for the Mexican-American movement, for the feminist movement, for the LGBTQ movement. These movements, can look to a longer history. Whereas wars are different, and anti-war movements are different too. So I think that's part of the reason we don't know much about that. But I wrote this book because I think there's nothing more important in history, you might argue, nothing that affects people more as a whole than war. And so those Americans who tried to stop U.S. entry into this great war, which did so much to shape the 20th century, ought to be understood and ought to be remembered. Thank you.